Hi, Sam Roberts here from Roberts Geospatial. Today we're going to look at the product editor in ProRaster Scientific. So I've got ProRaster Scientific running. I'll hit the Browse Products button and choose my product database that I want to work with. In the product database, I'll see one or more products. And then I either right-click or double-click on that row to bring up the product editor. The product database and the scene database browsers are modeless, so you can have them open at the same time. You can have multiple copies of them open, and then you can close them. It won't close your editor. So here's the editor. And it has two sections. It has a tree on the left-hand side, and then depending on what I click on, over here there'll be property pages. So if I click on statistics, for example, I get a whole bunch of different property pages, whereas most of the other operations, I just get a generic page, and then I get a map preview page. If I select any item in this tree, or what we'll call from now on an operation, and select any operation in this tree, its properties will be displayed in the spreadsheet. I can also right-click on any operation in the tree, and I'll get a bunch of options. The options that you'll see will depend on the operation. So in this top section, we have operations that get immediately executed, so I can render now, and that will render that product operation in the ProRaster main interface. In the second section, I've got options to add new operations into the product, and down the bottom we have new operations that actually compute things, and also some options for executing. And I'll explain that in a minute. So there's various ways to describe this thing. It's like a waterfall or a cascade. So everything further down the tree, if you think about the tree, this is the trunk, these are the branches, and these are the leaves of the tree. So the leaves depend upon the branches depend upon the trunk. So everything depends on the item to which it is to its parent item. So when you change anything in this operation tree, everything that operation itself will update, and then everything that's underneath it will also update. So if I was to change this calculator operation, change the formula, then that calculator operation would update, this clip operation would update, and then the statistics operation and these two rendering operations would also update. Now, most operations are involve no processing. So for example, this Spectral Index operation, if that was to update, it wouldn't trigger any processing. All it does is write a virtual raster into the folder that's associated with the product database. So that's a fast operation. So is calculator, so is clip. All these things do is create virtual rasters. But on the other hand, down here, right on the leaves of the tree, you have operations like statistics, and there's another one, for example, export. These operations actually trigger the computation of data, and so they force the whole virtual raster chain to evaluate, and they actually result in processing time, and you'll get a progress dialog as those things progress. So let's start up here at our scene sequence. So every product starts with some kind of scenes or some kind of other product. And in this case, we started with multiple scenes in a time sequence. So if we look over here at our operation property page, you can see that it has a name. You can edit this name if you want, and I encourage you to do that. It has a description, and then down here it has some XML which you can't edit, but which you can browse in order to see what the product properties are. So here we have an operation. The operation was to create a product. There were a bunch of scenes that were inputs to that product. And then down here we have an output raster, and that raster is called scene sequence A.mvr. And if you go and look in the folder that's associated with this product database, you'll find that raster. On this page is a modify and run operation button. So if I click that, it will bring up the property dialog for that particular operation. You'll be able to modify it, and then when you hit OK, it'll run that operation and everything else that is subordinate to that operation. The other way to do exactly the same thing is to double click on the item in the tree. So if I double click on the scene sequence, I get this little dialog for editing a scene sequence. So I have a list of my scenes. I can add a new scene, and I can remove a selected scene. So if I go into add a new scene, for example, it will ask me which database I want to select my scene from. Hit OK, and that will give me a list of scenes that are spectrally compatible with the existing product. So it won't give me all the scenes in the database. It will only list the ones that I can select for that particular product. So I could select this scene, hit OK, and it will go into the scene sequence. So I'm not going to keep that. And you can see here the output file name is the scene sequence A.mvr. Note that these file names are not editable. They are assigned automatically. You don't need to change them. You don't need to set them yourself. The system manages all of that. So I'll just cancel out of that. So on the right-click menu, I just want to explain these two down here. Right down the bottom it says execution enabled and execute operation. So by default, execution is enabled. So whenever I edit any operation and hit OK, it will trigger execution of all the product operations at that operation and subordinate to that operation. If you click execution enabled off, you'll see it changes to execution paused. So then I can go in and edit these things. So I can go into this calculator operation and edit this operation and hit OK, and it won't actually do anything immediately. Then later on I can come in and say execute operation and update everything. So that would be useful if you had statistics or export operations which might take a long time or a reasonable amount of time to execute. So you might want to do all your editing and then execute the operation once you've finished and trigger the computation of those statistics or the output of your of a raster. All these things also have a preview page, so click on that and you get a little map view. You can't modify this map view. You can zoom and pan in just the same way as you would normally do in any other map in ProRaster, but you can't change the way that this is being displayed. So if I click on the spectral index, for example, then I get a lookup table color display of the spectral index. If I click on the clip buffer polygon operation, then I've got that spectral index modified by that calculator operation clipped to that buffer, and you can see there's now clipped to a polygon. So if I right click, let's have a look at these options. So at the top we have display now and render now. So if I hit render now on this scene sequence, it will bring up the red, green, blue combinations algorithm, where you can choose your red, green, blue band combination. And where are we? So whatever, choose the bands and hit OK. It'll create a rendering algorithm in ProRaster and display the data. Display now does a much simpler thing. It just creates a lookup table color algorithm. And you can use that to go through, for example, you might be interested in looking at some of these masks or ancillary data. Here's the atmospheric transmittance or whatever. So that's useful for looking at those sorts of things. You can also say show in folder. So this is going to open a file explorer in the folder that product is being stored. So it's the folder associated with the product database. Let's have a look at some of the operations that you can do. So you can build a chain of virtual raster operations. And the operations that you have available are firstly masking by a raster. So we have one down here. Let's double click on it. So mask operation is a clip operation, but you're clipping based on a raster rather than a polygon. So in all of these operations, you've got an input and you've got an output, and these things are not editable. They're displayed so you can see what they are, but you can't change them. But what you can change are the properties of the operation. So here we can choose the masking band. We can use pixels or land or water or whatever we want. Or we can choose, if we click this off, we can go and actually choose the raster that we want to mask our scene sequence by. So that's a mask operation. Similar to mask is clip by polygon. So now we're clipping our data not to some other raster, but to a polygon. So again, we have our inputs and our outputs, which we can't edit. And then in here we have a polygon, so we can browse to a map info tab file containing our polygon. And once you've browsed to polygons, they'll appear in this recently used polygons list, and you can select quickly and easily from there. So that's our clip operation. Right click again, reproject. So we have a reproject operation. Again, we have our inputs and we have our outputs. We have the current coordinate system, and then we can select a new coordinate system for the raster. We have a list of coordinate systems that we've recently selected, or if you hit this button, you can go into the Projection Explorer and choose a coordinate system. So I can double click over here and it'll give me some coordinate systems that are, or projections that are appropriate for where I've clicked in the map. And of course there are all sorts of other options. I can also change the cell size, and I can change the origin coordinate. I'm not going to explain that at this point in time. So reprojecting rasters might be useful if you have mosaics that spread over multiple UTM zones, for example. The system will try to choose an appropriate projection for mosaics like that, but at some point you may want to specify the projection yourself. And that's when you would use that reproject operation. And again, that's just a virtual raster. It doesn't do anything until you actually go and evaluate the processing chain. So we have render algorithm, and there's another option we're not seeing here called display algorithm. These are just like display now and render now, except that it will create the rendering algorithm and save it into an MRD file and place it into the operation. So if I say render algorithm, I choose my spectral target, I choose which band combination I want, So let's say I want to mask it by clear land. I hit OK. And now appears in the product editor. I can right click on it and say open in ProRaster, and there's the rendering algorithm that I just created. Now I can go in here and modify it. For example, I can change the data transform and say save, and that's actually saved in here in the product. So it's kind of handy to store your rendering algorithms in the product editor, because you'll notice that I've never actually specified a file name for that rendering algorithm, and I don't need to know what it is. I can just go to it in here and say open in ProRaster and display it. I don't need to go and browse for the MRD file or worry about the naming of that file. It's always stored with the product, so you know where it is. It's kind of handy. Same with these display options. So these are rendering algorithms that just display, in this case, the burnt area index. So going down the list, okay, so we have the index, spectral index computation. And this is one of the most important ones. So depending on what spectral bands you have in the data set, you'll get a whole bunch of spectral indexes that can be computed. So some for geology, various things for metals, mostly ferric, different measures of iron, agriculture, soil, various measures of fire scar, vegetation. There's squillions of vegetation indices, tasseled cap, various other ones, and then there are some duplicates down here, because index calculations are there's opportunities for errors to be made, and different organisations can use different formulas. So these are the ones that Envy use, and it uses the formulas that they quote in their software. And if you're familiar with Envy, then you might want to use these particular ones to make sure that you get exactly the formula that you anticipate. And you can see that if you click on these, it'll tell you down here what the name of that index is, and it'll also give you the formula for that index. So for example, here's the green atmospherically resistant vegetation index, and here's a big long formula for how that will be computed. So you can select one of these, or you can select all of them if you want. It doesn't matter, because all it's going to do is produce a virtual raster. So until you actually go and compute something like statistics or an export, how many of these you have selected doesn't matter. And just some other notes up here, you do need to select your spectral target from which the data will be drawn. And then in here you have options to scale the data. Usually you won't need to do that, because you'll probably have selected reflectance. Right? You want to choose reflectance, so it's between 0 and 1. Some of these formulas assume that you have selected reflectance. If you haven't, if you've selected digital numbers for some reason, then you might have to scale your data in order to use these formulas. And then you've got this harmonize option as well, which will clamp your input values to between 0 and 1. So you've got those options. Next one is calculator. So let's bring up the calculator. So we have our destination file name. Again, you can't change that. We have an expression here, so we type our expression into this box here, and the expression is going to act on raster variables. Now, but by default, it's populated this list box with all the bands of the input raster, or the virtual raster that was input to this calculator operation. And you can see it says, A02 equals this raster with this field and this band. So bottom of atmosphere, reflectance, digital numbers, band 3, which is green. And so what you need to do in the expression is use these codes that are listed along the left here in your expression. So if I click on that code and then do Control V, it'll paste it into there. So I can do something like, a condition expression. If A58 is less than 0, then I'll write out A58, otherwise I'll write out null. So this is kind of a clipping operation. You can bring other rasters or other raster sources into the calculator. So if I go and select Merit DEM, for example, I can choose the fields and bands that I want to add in, and then it'll go into the list. And down here, I get B00 for Merit DEM. So I can say condition if B or is null B00 and A58 less than 0, and you can see how you can combine these inputs in your expression to create an output. So that's the calculator. Moving on, we also have the difference operator. So the difference operator will only be available when you have a sequence. So it might be a scene sequence or a mosaic sequence or collated mosaic, whatever it is. And it will compute the difference between one scene and another scene all the way along the sequence. So our input our sequence, our output, again, we can't edit any of this. It's a virtual raster. And down here we have this option to either compute a moving difference or a fixed difference. So if we say moving difference, then it's going to compute the difference in all fields and bands between scene A and the next scene. And it's going to write that out to the virtual raster. And it will move that moving difference along the scene sequence, so you'll get the difference between every scene in the sequence. On the other hand, with a fixed difference, you're going to display the difference between every scene and some key scene which you specify. So here it'll give you all of the dates of the events in the scene sequence. You choose the one that's the key event, and then we'll output the difference between every other event and that event. Now this is essentially just a calculator operation, and a calculator operation has a calculator expression. And we actually list it down here in case you want to edit it. Now, it will just be event minus key event, and it's the same for moving difference. But you could do things like, for example, make it the absolute value of event minus key event, so that everything is positive, or whatever you want it to do. You can modify that expression that goes into the difference computation. So that's your difference operator. And then down below that we have statistics and export. So that statistics triggers computation of statistics of the raster at that point in the operation tree. And when you compute statistics, you'll get all these property pages containing the summary, the spatial statistics, you have this report capability here, and you have the histogram. And if you've got a sequence, then you'll be able to click through all of the events in the sequence to see that histogram. Histograms can be shown as either a spreadsheet or a graph, and you can put some stretch on that graph. Note here from the summary page, you can click one of these buttons. So view the statistics report in your default text editor. So that comes up over here. So here's the statistics report. It contains data and also readable statistical information. Over here, view statistics data in your default spreadsheet. So we, in addition to outputting the statistics report as a text file, we also output the data as a comma delimited file, a CSV file. So if I click on that, it will come up in your default spreadsheet which is Excel in my case, and you'll get a bunch of statistics. Not all of the statistics, but just mainly the summary statistics and the spatial statistics in your spreadsheet editor. So that's statistics. We also have an export option, so let's put that in. So our input is fixed. Our output is also fixed, but I have the option to export to either an MRR file, and that's the best option. You can then use that in ProRaster, but you can't really use it in anything outside of ProRaster, so there's another option here to output to either GeoTIFF or band interleaved, and in that case it will output all of the data to different GeoTIFFs. So for each band in the input raster, you'll get a GeoTIFF written as an output raster. And there'll be a kind of a folder structure generated with all these GeoTIFFs in it. You can choose the resolution level, choose whether or not you want to export events, choose which fields and bands you want to export. Here we only have our calculator expression band. Let's hit OK, see what happens. It brings up this execution script. It's output that raster, and is the product editor dialog. There's a lot more detail in there. There's more things to explain in those operation properties dialogues. And there's a lot of depth to this. You'll use it to do your analysis of multispectral data. So this is really where the analysis comes in. It segues into rendering as well. It works with your rendering. And at the end of the day, what you'll get is your statistics, which you use for your analysis, and your exported rasters, which you might take into other products. So thanks for watching.